Okay, well, here we are. Welcome to Breaking Dimension.
Thank you, Ben. It's a great pleasure to be here. So what I'm going to do is talk about, I'm in departments of psychiatry and neuroscience at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And I'm going to talk about our work and experimental studies with psilocybin-occasioned mystical type experiences, the findings and implications. Before I do, I just want to acknowledge that funding has been a patchwork from a number of different sources. So we have grants from the Hefter Research Institute, the Beckley Foundation, Riverstick Foundation, Council on Spiritual Practices, Betsy Gordon Foundation, and the National Institute on Drug Abuse. And I also just want to acknowledge that this work is being done by a wonderful team of investigators, including myself and Dr. Johnson, Catherine McLean, Bill Richards, Mary Casamano, Brian Richards, and Una McCann. So psilocybin, as we've heard about, is a naturally occurring tryptamine alkaloid, and it's the principal psychoactive component in the psilocybe genus of mushroom. There are about over 100 different species of these mushrooms exist, and they've been used for thousands of years, hundreds if not thousands of years, by different cultures, usually sacramentally, for divinatory or religious type purposes. Pharmacologically, we call them classic hallucinogens, and examples of classic hallucinogens are the tryptamine class, so that's psilocybin, DMT, and LSD, and phenethylamine class, mescaline, DOM, MDA, and 2CB. All of these compounds bind to serotonin 2A receptors, and a nice descriptive phenomenological definition that I like was provided by Greenspoon and Bacalar back in '79, and this is for classical hallucinogens, a drug which, without causing physical addiction, craving, major physiological disturbances, delirium, disorientation, or amnesia, more or less reliably produces thought, mood, and perceptual changes otherwise rarely experienced except in dreams, contemplative and religious exaltation, flashes of involuntary memory, and acute psychosis. So the classic hallucinogens are in the United States scheduled as put in Schedule 1. That's our most restrictive category where there's no recognized medical use. And then just another point about this class, although survey data show that the risk of addiction, that is compulsive drug taking, and dependence and toxicity is pretty low, there remains concern about abuse because of potential adverse effects, including panic reactions, possible precipitation of enduring psychiatric conditions, and long-lasting visual perceptual disturbances. So just to give you a little bit of background, in late 1999, we very cautiously initiated our first studies with psilocybin, and we sought to administer psilocybin to volunteers without any history of prior exposure to a classic hallucinogen. And as you might imagine, because we were breaking precedent at that point with literally a 40-year history in the United States where no such protocol had been approved in volunteers with no prior histories. Our institution, the ethical board, as well as the Food and Drug Administration, the federal authorities that regulate these kinds of clinical trials, scrutinized our protocol very, very closely. But the good news was that Reason won the day. We initiated a program of research with psilocybin, which is continuing on. And today what I want to do is briefly review 2 clinical studies in healthy volunteers that we've conducted, one published, one unpublished, and then end by talking very briefly about a clinical trial we have going in cancer patients and another pilot study of smoking cessation and psilocybin. So this is kind of the overview for the 2 studies in healthy volunteers. I'm collapsing demographics and some of the descriptions across the 2 studies, and I'm going to intermix the results. So both studies were double-blind, crossover designed. In the first study, we had 36 participants. There were 2 or 3 sessions at 2-month intervals, and we were comparing a high dose of psilocybin, 30 milligrams per 70 kilogram. That's equivalent to about 6 grams of dried cubensis mushroom and 40 milligrams of methylphenidate or Ritalin. And the design effectively obscured to volunteers and the monitors who were overseeing the sessions exactly what the drug conditions were being tested. And I just don't have time to go into the detail of that, but we did quite a bit of juggling and providing enough information that we confused people as to the nature of the design of the study, other than that they would at some point receive a high dose of psilocybin. And the second study is 18 participants. It's essentially a dose effect study, 5 sessions at 1-month intervals. We compared placebo, 5, 10, 20, and 30 milligrams per 70 kilogram in mixed sequence across sessions. The participants were recruited from the local community through flyers and newspaper advertisements, and those advertisements announced a study of states of consciousness brought about by a naturally occurring psychoactive substance used sacramentally in some cultures. The study participants were medically and psychiatrically healthy. They were without histories of hallucinogen use. And we did this for a couple reasons. One was that we wanted to minimize expectancy effects, and 2 is we wanted to minimize selection bias that would be created if people differentially participated based on having positive experiences with these kinds of drugs. Volunteers didn't receive monetary compensation. Their participation was largely based on curiosity and this chance for deep introspection. So these are the demographics: 54 volunteers, average age 46 years, half female, highly educated group, almost all college graduates. More than half had postgraduate educations. Most were employed either full-time or part-time. We had a wide range of professional vocations represented in this group. We had physicians and nurses and counselors and pastoral counselors, lobbyists, business owners, consultants. So it was a diverse, high-functioning group of people. And in terms of religious spiritual activities, all 54 indicated at least intermittent participation in religious or spiritual activities, such as religious services, prayer, meditation, choir, educational or discussion groups. And we did that intentionally because of the long sacramental use of these compounds, and also to avoid variability in possible results. But it remains a very interesting area for future research to vary people with respect to that background orientation. We had quite a bit of clinical preparation for these sessions. So they met for at least 8 hours total before the first session with a monitor who was either a clinical psychologist or a social worker, and 4 hours after each session. And the major purpose of this was to develop and maintain rapport, which we believe to be important to minimizing the risk of adverse reactions to psilocybin. The study took place in reasonably aesthetically laid out living room-like laboratory environment. The sessions were 8 hours in duration. Participants came to the unit at 8 in the morning and capsules were administered orally. During sessions, there were 2 monitors who were present throughout the 8-hour session. The volunteer was encouraged to lay down on the couch, wear eye shades and headphones through which they listened to a program of classical music, and they were encouraged to direct their attention inward. So this wasn't a guided sort of session. It wasn't psychotherapy. This was going into the experience and paying attention to what happens there. The guides were present and important. If fear or anxiety emerged during the session, then the guides would provide supportive reassurance, either verbally or with a touch, a reassuring touch to the shoulder or to the hand. But overall, it was our intention to create an atmosphere in which people could have their own experience. So this shows time course of some monitor ratings occurring during the session. This is, of course, from the dose effect study, showing that, so you have nice orderly dose effects. I don't think I've ever been running psychopharmacology studies for 35 years, and I don't think I've ever had such lovely dose and time-related effects before. And you can see onset is generally 30 to 60 minutes, peaking at about 2 or 3 hours, and then gradually decreasing over the period of 6 hours shown here. And interestingly, 5 milligrams of psilocybin is really quite active on these measures. So in terms of self-reported effects of psilocybin, not surprisingly, psilocybin increased measures previously been shown sensitive to these classic hallucinogens. So there were perceptual changes, visual illusions, greater emotionality, increased joy, peacefulness, and less frequently fear and anxiety. And cognitive changes, a sense of meaning and sometimes suspiciousness. But I think the most interesting effect to us is that in most volunteers, psilocybin produced large increases on self-rated questionnaires designed to measure naturally occurring mystical experiences. And so this shows results from the Hood Mysticism Scale and the Pankey-Richards Mystical Experience Scale. Andy Lecter mentioned Hood as having developed some of these scaling measures to measure mystical experience. And actually the interesting thing about the Hood scale, that's the best validated scale of this type in the psychology of religion, it had never ever been used in a drug study before. I mean, this was developed to assess spontaneously occurring mystical type experiences. So we're getting nice dose-related increases on this, and most of the volunteers, 60 to 70%, fulfilled a priori criteria for having a so-called full mystical experience. And I just wanted to describe the phenomenological dimensions of that kind of experience that have been worked out by the people in psychology of religion, and starting with William James and Stace, also mentioned by Andy Lecter. So the core feature of these experiences is this sense of unity, an interconnectedness of all people, all things, the sense that all is one. Sometimes it's pure consciousness. And this is accompanied by a sense of sacredness or reverence, a humility before the majesty of something thought to be sacred. There's a noetic quality to these experiences, a sense of encountering ultimate reality, that the experience is more real, more true than everyday waking consciousness. There's deeply felt positive mood, sometimes described as heart-opening or universal love, joy, peace, tranquility. Transcendence of time and space, so the past and the present collapse into the present moment. That's all there is. Space becomes endlessly vast. and inaffability and paradoxicality. These kinds of experiences just elude ready description and putting them into words. And there's a resolution in terms of paradoxicality. Seeming opposites are reconciled in this state. So the consciousness is both a complete void and it's ultimately full at the same time. Good and evil can coexist, and neither is any better or worse than the other. So the effects of psilocybin resolved physiologically by the end of the session day, but the interesting piece here is that the memories of these mystical experiences lingered. And so here we have a questionnaire asked 2 months after sessions. And this is the psilocybin methylphenidate study. How personally meaningful was this experience on a scale like an everyday experience, once a week, once a month, up to top 10, top 5, single most personally meaningful experience of my life. This is what we're talking about. And the dark bars show the psilocybin results. And so the remarkable piece here is that about 70% of this group is saying that this is among the 5 most meaningful experiences of their lives. And you ask someone, what does that mean? And they compare it to the birth of their firstborn child, a death of a parent. It's in the ballpark of the major things that have ever happened to them. And here at the same time, how spiritually significant was this experience? So in this group of people who are already spiritually interested and inclined, 30% are saying it's the single most spiritually meaningful experience of their life, and 70% are saying it's in the top 5. This is data from the dose effect study, essentially showing the same thing, except that it shows that we have nice dose-related effects. This is endorsement of spiritually significant in the top 5, and it's going up to 80% after the 30 milligrams per 70 kilogram. And this is the subgroup of people who called it the single most meaningful experience. In this case, we have about 40% in the high dose. And these are at 1 month, but these effects linger far past then. So we've done 14-month follow-up in both studies. And this is just illustrative of that. Here's 5 most meaningful experiences after a month. Here it is after 14 months. So there's no diminution of effect. The remembrances of these experiences are really quite vivid. This slide summarizes some changes in the volunteers' reported attitudes about life and self, mood changes, altruistic or social effects, and positive behavioral changes. These were 60 different questions that then are divided in here. And you can see psilocybin is producing significant increases over methylphenidate. So what are they saying here? So the attitudes, people are claiming to have more personal integration, more meaning, enthusiasm, patience, optimism, authenticity, self-confidence. In terms of mood, they're claiming increased love, open-heartedness, joy, inner peace, decreased sadness, anger, and guilt. In terms of altruism, positive social effects, people are claiming to be more sensitive, compassionate, tolerant, increased positive relationships, increased need for service to others, and social concern. And this shows, again, equivalent data for the dose effect study. Again, we're seeing nice dose effects here on all these same dimensions. So this is questionnaire data. At the end of 14 months, we also asked them to write descriptions of what was it that made this experience meaningful. In this case, we're asking of their spiritually significant experiences, why does this stand out? Why do you remember this? And this is just an example of 4 volunteers' responses in their own words at 14 months. So the part that continues to stick out for me was the knowing and the seeing and the experiencing with every sense and fiber of my being that all things are connected. It's another one. A sense that all is one, that I experience the essence of the universe that the knowing that God asks nothing of us except to receive love. A third, feeling of no boundaries, where I didn't know where I ended and my surroundings began. Somehow I was able to comprehend what oneness is. And finally, the understanding that in the eyes of God, all people, abusers abused, Christian fundamentalists, Muslim fundamentalists, atheists, were all equally important and equally loved by God, and that given the proper circumstances, I could be any one of them. And it wasn't just the volunteers who were making these kind of reports, because my skeptical psychiatric colleagues would say, well, are they delusional? And so what we did is we interviewed friends, family members, and coworkers, did telephone interviews before, during, and after the study. And we probed things like patience, optimism, interpersonal relations, compassion, expression of emotion. And these ratings showed the same kinds of effects. So the observers were endorsing changes in dimensions that were similar to those reported by the volunteers. So here's the significant increase over the methylphenidate group in the methylphenidate study. In the dose effect study, here we're having elevations at 1 month, falling off somewhat by 14 months, but remaining significantly above baseline. So these persisting changes in attitudes and moods prompted us to ask another question, and that is, does personality affect, or does psilocybin affect personality? And what we recently did is combine the data from the two studies to ask this question. And what we showed is in the group, psilocybin does, let me just say something about personality. That cross-cultural studies of personality structure, this is a very mature area in psychological sciences, have demonstrated 5 reliable and stable domains of personality: neuroticism, extroversion, agreeableness, openness, and conscientiousness. And the gold standard for measuring personality, at least in the United States, is the NEO personality inventory. So what we did is combined the two studies and did an analysis of psilocybin effects on personality structure. And what we showed was that psilocybin increased the openness domain of personality. And when we looked at that more closely, we showed that the entire effect was accounted for in those people who fulfilled criteria for having a full mystical experience. So this is the subgroup who didn't have a mystical experience. Those that did are showing elevations in this domain of openness. And this effect is interesting because personality is an independent domain of, or openness is an independent domain of personality, and personality structure is considered to be very stable across the lifetime and cross-culturally. So you don't expect manipulations to change personality, frankly. Openness is an interesting domain because it encompasses aesthetic appreciation and sensitivity, imagination and fantasy, and broad-minded tolerance of others' viewpoints and values. Openness is fundamental to our whole concept of creativity and predicts creativity in a wide range of domains in the arts and the sciences and the humanities. And this effect is reasonably robust, so the NEO personality inventory allows you to measure different facets of openness. And this is just showing some of those facets: fantasy, aesthetics, feelings, ideas, values. All of them are significantly changed in these people that have mystical experiences. So psilocybin is producing a variety of very positive effects, but I don't want to leave you with the impression that psilocybin sessions were without challenges. Fear, anxiety, and dysphoria, even under these conditions when we have carefully prepared people and are closely monitoring people, emerged. 33% of the volunteers after our high dose of psilocybin and none after placebo or methylphenidate reported strong or extreme feelings of fear sometime during the session. And fear and anxiety had an unpredictable time course and onset of duration. I'll come back to that. In the dose effect study, these effects occur almost exclusively at the 30 milligrams per 70 kilogram dose. So there's only 1 out of 18 volunteers at 20 milligrams that had this kind of effect, none at lower doses. 9% of the total group of volunteers reported their entire session was dominated by anxiety or unpleasant psychological struggle. And about 25% had mild, transient, paranoid thinking or ideas of reference sometime during the session. Despite these struggles, however, most of these participants rated the overall experience as having personal meaning and spiritual significance. And very importantly, no volunteer rated the experience as having decreased their sense of well-being or life satisfaction. And this shows that erratic time course of the emergence of anxiety across the session. I just show this to alert people that monitors actually need to be on their toes during these sessions. So here, this is just 5 volunteers, high dose. Here's someone who had anxiety throughout most of the session. Here's someone who had no anxiety through an hour and a half and then peaks with a high anxiety that comes down. Here's someone who peaks anxiety and then it comes down and then reemerges higher later in the session. So the conclusions from these experimental studies with careful volunteer screening and preparations, and when the studies are conducted in a comfortable, well-supervised setting, moderate and high doses of psilocybin can be administered safely. Despite extensive preparation, 9% of the people were encumbered by significant anxiety throughout the session. And most interesting to us, under these conditions, psilocybin-occasioned experiences that have marked similarities to classic mystical experiences. And so the implications, I think the most interesting implication is this: the finding that psilocybin can occasion in most people studied mystical type experiences virtually identical to those that occur naturally suggests that such experiences are biologically normal. That is, we're wired for these kinds of experiences. You just need to perturb the system in such a way and it comes forward. And the implication of that is that such experiences are now, for the first time, amenable to systematic, prospective scientific investigation. And that's the reason that I'm so excited about this. There's so many different ways that you can take this research into biological psychiatry. How does personality, genetics, personal intention affect these experiences? What happens if you recruit atheists? What happens if you recruit in people who want to start a meditation practice? And we're doing this kind of study right now. Neuroscience, Franz Vollenweider and Robin Cartwright-Harris will talk about some of the neuroscience work. But this is wide open to do reductionistic neuroscience. And then therapeutically, are there therapeutic benefits to such experiences? And so hearkening back to the 1960s, there were studies in cancer patients. We're doing a cancer trial currently in people who are anxious or depressed secondary to their cancer diagnosis. The study's still blinded, but I can tell you anecdotally, people are experiencing mystical type experiences of the type that they had in the healthy volunteers. And it's deeply moving, frankly, to see someone who's contemplating their own demise be so moved by these experiences. And secondarily, they take this change attitude home and actually provide reassurance to their care providers. It's really quite remarkable. So the final thing that I just want to mention is that we've also initiated a study on treatment of drug dependence. And this is being done collaboratively with the Beckley Foundation. And it's just a pilot study, but it's interesting. So this is to determine whether psilocybin experiences can facilitate treatment of smoking cessation in treatment-seeking nicotine-dependent smokers. The approach involves integration of cognitive, behavioral, and guided imagery with our techniques for preparing people for psilocybin sessions. There are multiple psilocybin sessions involved, much as Dr. Krapinski just mentioned, up to 3 sessions starting at the target quit date for smoking, going out to 8 weeks. First dose is 20 milligrams, second and third dose is 30 milligrams per 70 kilogram. Outcome measures include breath, carbon monoxide, cocaine, and some subjective measures. And so far, so good. We have 3 volunteers treated today. 1 remains abstinent at 6 months. 2 remain abstinent at better than a year. This just shows urinary cocaine. So just to wrap up, the point that I want to make on the experimental or on the clinical application is that they really have broad therapeutic and public health implications. So if this approach with cancer patients shows efficacy, it would likely be applicable to the treatment of individuals struggling with any life-threatening medical condition. And ultimately, that's all of us, right? And likewise, if the approach is effective in treating the behavioral problem of cigarette smoking, a similar approach might well work in treating other kinds of pervasive behaviorally based public health problems, such as other drug dependence disorders, eating disorders, both anorexia and overeating, risky sexual behavior, and sedentary lifestyles. So there's great promise and much to be done. Thank you very much.